In this chapter, we kind of draw an extension. Now that we have some understanding of fiscal and monetary policy, what we do here is we expand it to talk about how it can actually be used and implemented to try to stabilize an economy. And so this is the first chapter in this set of chapters, chapter 14. So obviously the why economists seem so important in society is really our ability to not only or at least our confidence in being able to state that we know how the economy is going to do in the near future and why what's happening now is happening. So um, sort of the um, troubling thing is um, why, despite the fact that economists have all these great models for understanding the economy, why can't they do a better job of controlling it? Um, why can't economists basically eliminate recessions if they're so good at being able to talk about what makes them occur? So, going along with that, one of the things that we also see um, as well that a lot of the way that we think about how the economy is performing, a lot of it's also linked to the stock market. So it seems only reasonable that we would talk a little bit about what the stock market is, at least a little bit. Um, so, just kind of going off an understanding. Um, Basically, let's start from the first step here. So, um, a stock is basically a stake of ownership in a company. And that would mean that while you have a stake in the profits and the benefits of that company, you're also liable to lose all of your money if that firm should go bankrupt. Um, these corporations, they exist in markets such as the Dow Stock Exchange, the Nasdaq. So these are the major exchanges in the U.S. The Nasdaq and um, the Dow, and then most major corporations, the only way they can raise the billions and billions of dollars that they need is by selling shares of ownership to be able to raise vast sums of money. It's pretty rare to find companies out there that are entirely privately owned rather than publicly owned, which is what exists when there's a stock market, when the company issues stock. Um, I'm trying to think of some of the largest um, non-public companies. So in finance, or Northwestern Mutual is an example of a company that is does not have stock that's issued. Um, I'm pretty sure. um, uh, yeah, it's privately owned, which is pretty amazing when you consider the fact that it has um, that much in assets and in revenue. That's a rather large size um, for existing like that. Um, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna. Oh, Cargill. Oh, interesting. Coke Industries. So Coke Industries, that would be one that for those of you who are interested in companies that do things. The Coke Industries um, had two very conservative brothers that ran the company, and they would give to those causes. Ernst and Young, those are accountants. You got Publix, that's a grocery store in Florida. Um, no, Flying J, the big gas station. Enterprise, car rental. Albertsons, that would be um, groceries as well. So pretty interesting. Fidelity, I actually wasn't aware that they were. Loves, that's also another big. It's actually pretty interesting. These are a lot of either Meyer, so it's kind of like a Midwestern Walmart. And there's a lot of grocery stores, and there's a lot of accountants. um, Cargill, though the largest, that would be grain operators. What's amazing about these privately owned companies is that's a lot of money to raise, and you have to have a family that owns that company that's not dramatically interested in cashing out and raising money dramatically. Now, not only when you own stock is it possible to earn a dividend, but another reason why individuals own stock, even if dividends aren't issued, is because of the capital gains. The capital gains would come about um, as the stock price rises in value over time. And so we can look at a company to contrast two companies here. The first one would be, let's look at Portland General. That would be the electric company for Portland. And they issue a dividend. And we can see that that dividend here is about 3.49% or $1.72 a year, I believe. So that's part of the value. But in terms of the capital gain, we would see that the capital gain is the fact that, let's say that you bought it February 22nd of last year, you could have bought it for $42.16, and that today it's worth about $7 more. That capital gain becomes realized, which is the other part of this. It becomes a realized capital gain when it's actually sold and you get that $7. Otherwise, it's an unrealized capital gain. Now, let's look at something like meta platforms. So, what was formerly known as Facebook, now known as Meta Platforms, like many other tech companies, does not pay a dividend. The value there is all supposed to come from capital gains. And in this case, if you invested last year at 257, today it's worth 207. You lost $50. Now, that $50 isn't realized until you actually sell it, but you might not be willing to sell it now that you lost $50 in the course of a year. It's not necessarily, it's. Let's talk about what does that investor look like that invests in Portland General versus the one that invests in Facebook. The investor that invests in Portland General, we would call that kind of stock in finance. We would call that kind of stock one that's. It sounds a little antiquated when I say this, but just keep in mind it's antiquated. Um, we would call that a stock for widows and orphans, meaning that the way that Portland General is set up as a company, you wouldn't have to worry about that company's ability to generate the revenue, the cash needed to pay out on that dividend, and which is what you'd want if you're a widow or an orphan, depending on that dividend to generate the money you need to survive. Um, Something like Meta Platforms or Facebook, you wouldn't want a widow or a orphan invested in this. Well, obviously they've lost $50 in this case, but also it's not generating a dividend. So the only way you can generate any money with this is by actually selling it. Um, and you're going to have to take the risk, in this case, that they're going to be able to change things and start to make more money. Now, why is it losing money? Well, there it's a little bit more complicated as well than Portland General. Portland General, right? Its biggest competition would be people making their own electric, I guess, right? Using solar power, things like that. For the case of Facebook, it's the fact that Apple and now Google Chrome Android are changing the way that they track um, what you search for, and how they can change the way that Facebook makes its money, which is selling advertisements. It turns out that Facebook or Meta platforms can't sell advertisements in the same kind of way that they used to be able to. There are also stocks, like in the case of Portland General, where it's not only generating that dividend, but also generating a capital gain. And there, the capital gain and the dividend, that would give you your total return. It's not always good to have, why does a company like Facebook, why do they not pay a dividend? They want the money so they can generate new products. Portland General, I mean, yes, they have to buy new equipment and maintain the equipment that they have, but making electricity, um, it's not. They can set aside some of the money they bring in to pay out the dividend. They don't need to stockpile cash to develop new products like Meta Platforms needs to. Um, there's whole fields of study in finance that talk about how you value a stock. Um, And if the future dividends are greater, for instance, then we'd expect the stock price to be greater because you'd be being paid cash. Though that future money you receive would need to be discounted because of the fact that you get it in the future. But also, what we see with the tech stocks is that even though there's not a dividend being paid, the value still seems to go up quite a bit. And the reason why it may go up quite a bit is because, you know, uh, how Portland General can bring in money is pretty limited. They just have to get people to use more electric, but that doesn't move that quickly. Unlike a technology where you can get mass adoption of the item. The perfect example of that for the pandemic would be Zoom. Zoom as a company was a darling of the pandemic, as everyone, not only in the classroom but in corporate side, all had to have Zoom meetings. So prepare yourself, right? And so, as a result, when the company was introduced shortly before the pandemic, you saw this ramping up of growth as the pandemic occurred. And it became the standard thing that people would use rather than Skype or Google Meets or anything like that. So you had this huge ramp up in valuation to $470. And now it has fallen to 126. So if you get on its high at 470, yeah, that's pretty sucks. That sucks quite a bit. Um, because it's not likely that you're going to be able to capture that back anytime soon unless the company develops a new product. And again, no dividend being paid out. And so when you hear about things, you typically don't hear about, you might hear about individual stocks, but more likely than not, you'll hear about the large averages, which is a way of just talking about how things are changing um, for the largest stocks. So we have the Dow Jones, that's the 30 largest companies. So let's look at who the members are of the Dow Jones. So that would be the 30 stocks, and this list has existed. Changes are made over time, but this list has existed um, Originally was developed in the late 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. Does it say? It doesn't say. But here we go, right? So we've got big companies that we would consider. Um, and here's just our short list here: 3M, American Express. These are all companies that are pretty familiar, I'm sure, to you. Disney, Coke, Goldman Sachs, IBM, Johnson and Johnson, McDonald's. I'm just skipping around here. Nike, Procter and Gamble, Walgreens, Walmart, Visa. These are really, really big companies. Really, really big companies. Okay, and then we've got the Nasdaq. The Nasdaq um, is a pretty big index. It's dominated by companies like Facebook. So more recently, as Facebook has been going down, it's really affected the Nasdaq market quite a bit. And then the S&P 500. It's 500 of the largest firms by market value. So I'm not going to show you this list here, but the S&P 500 goes across goes across things. So these are just indices. Indices meaning it gives you kind of a snapshot of how um, the stock market in general is doing. What's interesting about this, to be honest, is that's actually not the today. This book is written in 2020, and it's written by economists who don't always know a great deal about the stock market, but people in the finance industry don't really look at these things anymore to understand how the stock market is doing. In fact, what they look at is in Vanguard. So Vanguard, if some of you don't know, is a company that sells investment products to individuals. But what they did is they created their own index called the Total Stock Market Index. And it turns out that most professionals use this index that they created to get a good handle on how the economy is doing. Um, and I think the Wall Street Journal did a pretty good article about it if you're interested in this kind of thing. Right here. So if you want to look at this from December 5th of 2021, um, based on an index few people know about, but now you do. um, so it's a pretty interesting article. So I'd encourage you to read it. We can improve the book. Okay. This is kind of pointless because after this point it really goes up. We can look at this pretty easy here. Let's just look at the S&P. I just don't want to look at the futures. I actually want to look at how it closed out today. Yeah, okay, let's just look at the futures, I guess. What I'm trying to show you here is that it's gone up dramatically. This is looking at the futures, which isn't exactly the same thing as the overall S&P 500. Actually, let's look at it from the Wall Street Journal. And we can see that right here, right? It's just been continually going up, such that the end value here today is 42.88. So it's obviously increased quite a bit, even since 2017. Um, we can also get this as well. I think we can actually get this in Fred. Well, we'd have to graph it with it, but we can see that companies have become dramatically more profitable um, after taxes since the pandemic, and so we'd see that being reflected here as well with a dramatic increase. Now, part of all of this, as well as many of you are thinking, um, pretty important in the economy as a whole as well, is the housing market. And we know that um, the housing market really did alter things quite a bit. Um, we know that housing is both something that we consume, but some people also treat it as an investment. And therein lies part of the problem is that um, those who treat it as an investment treat the house differently, like as a and financially than someone who owns it, who doesn't intend to sell it until they die or move away. Um, and you really see that shift in 2000. After the year 2000, you started seeing individuals treating housing much more as an investment than people just owning one house that they live in. And so, with that, we saw the housing market boom between 2000 and 2006, which then imploded into 2008 2009 crisis. And you can see that right here, right? That the growth dramatically, the dramatic growth in housing prices after uh, the year 2000. Now, why the year 2000? A lot of theories out there, but one of the reasons why would be that Alan Greenspan, who was the Federal Reserve Chairman at the time, he really did a great deal to reduce interest rates. And so it made it so that people were pushed to move into housing, um, not only that they could live in, but also as an investment, given that other investments weren't paying out as much. I don't think over here, I look at housing, look at housing inventory. Yeah, I can look at an index here. So in that housing index, we could see it reached a peak, then declined, but then you see the increase again. So some people are rightfully concerned about how much housing prices have increased since then, that it's actually exceeding where it was before the crisis happened. Um, Now, the reason why we're talking about the stock market and the housing market is that it affects how people buy things, right? Is that if people's wealth is all wrapped up not in their savings account or their checking account, but rather is wrapped up in the stock market and the housing market, then one of the things that they're doing is they're looking on like Zillow and saying, "Oh my God, if I'm just gonna my old address of where I used to live. If I go on here, I don't live here anymore, so this is not my address. I could see, wow, my old house is worth $233,000. And I'm like, oh, I only paid $50,000 for it. So then the person would be like, damn, I'm 4 times richer than I used to be. So I'm going to spend some more money. Eh, it's not really money that you get to have though until you actually sell the house. Same with the stock market. You don't actually have the capital gains until you actually um, sell the stock. And the the Federal Reserve, the central bank, which is the one that has to be concerned with um, um, how the economy is doing, they do have to look at how the housing market and stock indexes are doing because it will affect consumer spending. And consumer spending is so important. That's 70% of the overall spending in the GDP. So, what that got us to um, was a pretty severe financial crisis in 2008. And what happened is that as the housing market blew up, and related to that, stock market blew up in 2008, we had two things going on that became concerning. The one thing being that households spent less, but also the other concerning thing about this financial crisis was that households, the financial markets in general, were starting to freeze up so that people didn't have access to their cash anymore. And that last part was the more concerning part. So the Federal Reserve had to intervene, and it intervened and it spent $785 billion, which at the time was the largest bailout ever until COVID was multiple trillions of dollars. But at the time, $785 billion to do two things: one, to stabilize the housing market, and two, to bring liquidity back into the banking system and to stabilize the banking system. Um, in an attempt to basically build consumer confidence again for them to be able to spend money. Um, let's just skip this. Except I will say this: economists are, I wouldn't even say not very good. We're not good at all at predicting recessions. The joke that economists make is that they've predicted five of the last two recessions because they always think that another recession is coming down the line. And I know I laugh at that joke, but I'm well aware that you're probably not laughing at that joke. Um, so, given this, so then here's the kind of complication. Um, how do you try to stabilize the economy? Right. So that's kind of the innovation that comes with having Keynesian macroeconomics is this belief that there are these business cycles. We think we know what causes the business cycles. Now, how can we try to stabilize the business cycle? We do that with what we saw in the past two chapters, fiscal and monetary policy. The problem is that there's huge time delays. Not only does it take time to realize that there's a problem, but then it takes time to actually fix the problem. We're facing that right now. So, right now, there's a general consensus that we have inflation. And coming up here in a few weeks, the Federal Reserve is widely anticipated to increase interest rates. And yet, even after it does it, it's going to take about 6 months for that to actually have an effect on the economy and even start to try to slow down the overall inflation rate. So things just take a while. Um, and so what you see here is that despite the fact that there are these time delays, at least in non extreme situations and certainly time periods outside of COVID, we have done a pretty good job at getting a business cycle that looks more like B than A. Now, how do I know that? Because There's a group, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which dates the business cycles. Now, again, outside of COVID, let's look at these dates here. And so this data goes all the way back. They had to estimate these back in the 1800s. But what you'll see here is that these business cycles used to be pretty short. So they were wide fluctuations up and down here in the span of 3 years, here in the span of about 4 years, 4 years, 4 years, right? And then you get this really long one during the Grant administration that's like basically like 5 years. Sorry, not 5 years, about 8 years. And but pretty much as you go over time here, it looks to be about every 3 to 4 years you'd have a recession, an economic boom, and back to a recession again. Now let's fast forward here. Look at it now, more recently. You get a period of time here where it's 108 months, which took us basically all the way through the 1980s up until the first time we fought in Iraq. And then after we fought in Iraq that first time, you get another 10 years, over 10 years, all the way until the dot-com bubble bursts in November of 2001. Then you have a little bit of a shorter time here where during the housing market bubble, where you go from, for basically about 7 years. And then look at that, 146 months, right? Well over, um, 12 years, that take us all the way up until the pandemic. So we're getting very good at basically stretching out the expansion time periods. That's what we kind of see here, which is a little bit more concerning about the current challenges, because the current challenge of inflation caused by this rapid change in the economy caused by COVID, we don't have a lot of experience because we're kind of used to it all kind of working out and not having to change things quite a bit. Okay, so I've kind of been talking about this here, so I'm not sure what more I have to say. So again, the two time period legs that we have here that are concerning with both fiscal and monetary policy is that we have both a recognition leg that's recognizing that the problem exists. For the current inflation that we're facing right now here in 2022, it's taken us almost a year, maybe even closer to a year and a half, to realize that the inflation is not going away. So there's a year and a half, 18 months. Then we've got the implementation leg, the time it takes to put the desired policy into effect. So we've been talking about interest rates increasing then for about 3 or 4 months, knowing that we have to increase them, and then we still haven't increased them. So there you go. There's another about 12 weeks. Then you've got the response leg. There, it takes about 6 months for the interest rate increase to fully work itself through the economy. So there you go. That's 24 more weeks. And then that's just with monetary policy, right? The Federal Reserve changing the money supply. If you then want to do it through fiscal policy, the legs are even longer, right? Because the plan right now is that, for instance, we could try to fix the economy by doing this Build Back Better plan. Well, dude, passing a law is like impossible, right? Everyone dislikes everyone else, right? Both parties dislike each other. So trying to get a law passed, right? Not only to get Build Back Better passed, but then to set up all the offices and to have all the contracts drawn up and the money actually spent takes even longer. It takes years and years. And so, one of the problems, for instance, of the 2008 2009 crisis is that the Obama administration did things like shovel ready jobs or cash for clunkers. Fine programs. Problem is, takes too long. Same critique could be made of FDR during the Great Depression. It's great that you have like things like the Civilian Conservation Corps or other kinds of the WPA, other things like that. It's great that you have those things. It just takes too long. And as I had said previously, the Great Depression didn't get fixed by the WPA and the CCC and other kinds of programs made by FDR. It got fixed by the fact that we had to fight Germany and Japan and spend a lot of money on war materials. So in that case, thank God for World War II, because that's unfortunately what fixed the Great Depression. Unfortunately, it caused a great deal of death and destruction, as all wars do. And so you see this for fiscal policy. I disagree with this. I don't think that the response legs are. I don't think that the legs for monetary policy are longer than fiscal policy. Um, Firms and households are actually pretty sensitive to interest rate changes. I'm not. I disagree with the book. Um, I'm not going to test you on what the book thinks rather than what I think. And this is just two economists disagreeing about which one has a longer response lag. I think fiscal policy is much longer, much slower than monetary policy. The book disagrees with me. Okay. So now, um, God, it just bothers me. It's just not shorter for fiscal policy. It's not. Again, you can read this slide. Again, I take exception with the third bullet point. If I encountered a monetary problem, if I encountered an economic problem, I would rather use monetary policy than fiscal policy, if only because the Federal Reserve right now is doing something as I make this lecture in 2022 to do something to reduce inflation. Build Back Better never even got passed. So I'd rather not wait for fiscal policy. Um, Plus, politicians just want to get reelected. Economists don't really care too much. The other kind of problem that comes about with fiscal policy, as highlighted in this slide, is that most of the time, when you're trying to stabilize the economy, you're trying to use expansionary fiscal policy, meaning you're trying to stimulate economic growth, which would mean the government needs to spend more. But as you saw with the previous lecture, the government already spends a lot of money. In fact, it spends more than it brings in. And so it has these huge deficits and debt, which it's unable to pay back. And so using fiscal policy is only going to exacerbate or make worse an already existing problem of not being able to pay all our bills. Now, we can try to do things that try to, reduce the deficit and whatnot. I'm not really sure these next 4 slides really matter here, but and this kind of ends this lecture here. But we didn't really target a smaller deficit. We could think about how it's done, but I'm not going to test you on this just because we don't really do this. It's just, I think the book's way of saying it's hard to it's not useful to try to limit the deficit because you accumulate deficits during times when you need to. And so if you're going to force the deficit to be smaller when you actually when you need there to be more spending, you're not going to help the economy.